Hello, everybody. Welcome to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young, and I am from Ask Tetsu.
And hello, my name is Rita Rosenbach. I am from multilingualparenting.com. Be very welcome to tonight's really interesting session.
And hello, my name is Utelima Garibold from Ute's International Lounge. And we are very honored to welcome Dr. Thomas Bak as our guest today. Welcome, Thomas.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. My pleasure.
Yes, and Thomas, please allow me to quickly introduce you. Thomas was born and raised in Krakow, Poland. He studied medicine and worked as clinician and psychiatry and neurology in Bern, Berlin, Cambridge, and Edinburgh. Since his doctorate on aphasia, language disorders caused by brain diseases, his main interest has been the relationship between language, brain, and mind. He is working at the Department of Psychology, the Center of Clinical Brain Science, and the Center of Cognitive Aging and Cognitive Epidemiology at the University of Edinburgh. From 2010 to 2018, he was also the president of the World Federation of Neurology Research Group on Aphasia, Dementia, and Cognitive Disorders. He's also co-founder of the Healthy Linguistic Diet with Dr. Dina Mehmetbegovic-Smith, who we interviewed in the second session 2 weeks ago. So, Thomas, today's topic is bilingualism and the brain. So when we think about the brain, and those who maybe have read something about this, there is the assumption that there are very classical language areas in the brain. But can you maybe tell us where the language is stored in the brain? And yes, if there is any codependency on when we learn a language, if there is another part of the brain where the language is stored or activated in the brain when we learn them, the languages at an early stage or a later stage.
Well, thanks very much for the question. I mean, I would like to kind of get a step back before answering it for reasons which I think will become obvious in a moment, because over the last couple of decades, we had a fundamental change in our understanding of the brain. So when I was doing my PhD, the kind of usual metaphor, which I think still many people kind of believe in, is brain like a chest of drawers. So you have, here you have the socks, here you have the t-shirts, here you have, you know, other things. And the problem is kind of intuitively very convincing. And we know that there is a specialization in the brain, there are special areas and so on. But the problem is that you have this idea of kind of limited space in which you try to put things in. And that was really the predominant way, modularism, in which brain was conceptualized in the 80s or so, I mean, maybe in up to 90s. Now we shifted completely to seeing brain as a kind of giant network, or in fact, set of different networks. So it's not a single place, there are different places which then jointly produce the activity, get involved. Now, why is it fundamentally important? Firstly, because it means that we are not looking now for a special place in the brain, but for networks with different places being involved. But secondly, the first model found it very difficult to accommodate language, because then the question was, you know, which drawer is it in? So do you have then two languages in the same drawer? They must be kind of pushing each other. Or maybe you go into another drawer and there's no space, you know, for mass or whatever. Now, if you have network, you have exactly the opposite. If you add another line thread to a net becomes stronger and not weaker. So adding languages stabilizes the language system and makes it more robust rather than pushing one or the other away. So that's why this change has been so important. And we know now that language really, you know, activates a lot of different networks in the brain. So in a way, I mean, probably half of the brain will be active when we hear a word, think of producing something and so on. Coming to your second question about the age, it does matter because it seems that if languages are learned very early, the networks are almost overlapping. They are very, very similar. If a language is learned a little bit later, it seems to be slightly more distributed between left and right side of the brain. I mean, usually usually we have left-sided dominance. This is something which, again, the pendulum in science was going in both directions. So there was a time where people really believed, you know, first language here, second language there. Then it was said, well, it's complete rubbish. And now we came back, well, there is something about it, but it's not as simple. So from this point of view, I mean, there is a difference in lateralization with later languages, and this can become later important when we're speaking about different diseases, for instance, because in fact, having a little bit of language on the other side of the brain might be helpful in the recovery of aphasia.
Okay, so if I understand you right, so if I learn, for example, Italian at an early stage, and then I add German later on, they might be distributed in two different areas of my brain or activated in different areas of my brain at that point. But
well, yeah.
This change, if then I learn more about both languages, would they not be like closer together at some point and maybe even overlapping?
Well, I think we have to distinguish here the kind of functional and anatomical point of view. The point is not all cells in the same area of the brain are always doing the same job. There is a specialization, but it's a relative one. You can have an area in the brain. You know, we are not in our imaging. We cannot really go to the level of single cells. So the fact that a certain area of, you know, let's say 1 square centimeter is active doesn't mean that this area, all cells are doing the same job. It's like, imagine a big tower with offices, a lot of people working there, but in fact, they could be part of different companies doing different jobs. And so from this point of view, I think we need to move away from this idea of the kind of, you know, specificity. What you have is, you will have quite a lot of overlapping system across languages. And there is a lot of evidence showing that if you speak more than one language, all of them are active in our brain, whatever we speak. So when I'm speaking English now, still my Polish, German, and Spanish are being, so to say, active in the background. And so there's a good evidence for that. And that's where the whole idea of the kind of control mechanisms, executive functions, so came in, that bilinguals have always to kind of be able to switch, to activate, disactivate, and so on and so on. But as I say, it's not, so you have clearly overlapping areas, the so-called Broca and Wernicke area and so on, but you have also the networks going, so to say, into other parts of the brain. So it's more, I would say it's more, rather than area, I would say they are maybe the language headquarters, which are, so to say, in these two places, but they have their, so to say, other parts all across the brain.
Perfect. And another question would be, what is the importance of the main or preferred language, or if we want to call it mother tongue, or L1, so chronologically speaking, the first language that we learned or acquired, when considering the whole lifespan?
You see, this question would be very differently answered, whether we take the first or the second metaphor of the brain. So in a way, in the static view that we had, let's say 40 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, in this static view, or in fact 30, once you have the first language, it's there, it's for always, it's kind of, how do you say, nous on revient toujours de nos premiers amours. So it's kind of always like, you know, first language, first love is always there and so on. And then everything coming later is inferior. But in fact, if we take a dynamic view, and particularly if we put it together with what we have now as a pattern of people moving across different countries, studying in a different language than is their first language, then working in a different language than they studied, then maybe marrying someone who speaks a different language. All of this, by the way, is ticked for me. So then you end up in a moment where it's very difficult to say what is in fact the main language. And I would say in one of the of the papers that I wrote with Dina Mehmetbegovic, whom you had 2 weeks ago, with whom I work on this healthy cognitive healthy linguistic diet, is that we both like the notion of plurilingualism, which is very popular. I mean, very much promoted by European Commission and European Union. And the idea is that in a way there is this kind of all languages together. So I would say almost as a definition of plurilingualism, it's someone for whom it's impossible to say what is the main language, because there can be one language which is particularly good for expressing emotions, another more for professional work, and so on and so on.
that's exactly what we were talking about, I think, a few minutes ago. Another question would be, what level of fluency in another language is, based on your knowledge, necessary to gain what is called the bilingual advantage? Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this.
Well, I mean, that is a question I'm extremely interested in. And I would say that that is a question in which my background in medicine very much determines the way I am thinking about it. Namely, in medicine, we know that even if a certain drug, let's say, has a positive effect, we have to know how much of it to take, how often, and so on. I mean, if you take antibiotics, but you take only 1/4 of the dose, you will not really get rid of your infection. So from this, and this is something which I think is very often forgotten in the literature on bilingualism. We still need a lot of research on this question. I mean, there are a lot of studies, and some of them use, like, 2 lessons a week, some of them 3, some 4, some of them, only 1. And then people make, big judgments, oh, it works or it doesn't work. It will probably depend on the dose. So let's say out of the research I've done so far, I would probably say that the border might be somewhere around 4 or 5 hours a week. So let's say, one lesson of 2 hours a week, if people don't really do extra, won't really have much effect. We know that intensive courses, even for 1 week, have effect. And we know now from other studies that, let's say, 3 times 2 hours, 6 hours a week have an effect as well. So 2 is clearly not enough, 6 is probably enough. It needs to be somewhere in between. But as I say, it's not a very popular research because people very often want to have a kind of, decision, yes or no. But as I say, for a medic, it's obvious that it depends. The dose determines what effect you will get. It's like with physical exercise. I mean, if you go to the gym once a month, you will not be terribly fit. So you cannot compare things unless you look, so to say, at the, what we would call the kind of dose response curve.
Yes, this nicely links to our previous session with Dina, where she was mentioning the 5 episodes of language a day, or throughout the week, where we activate the different languages that we or our children are learning.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So,
and maybe just to link it to your first question, this also very, very much relates to the static versus dynamic view. So in a static view, you have your L1, you learn it, you have it for life. But we know that's not the case if you don't use your first language for the next 40 or 50 years. Then you become almost like a functional monolingual. So and there's quite a lot of work on attrition and so on. So from my point of view, it's much more the practice which matters than the perfection on the order.
Perfect. So this is actually in great connection with my next question. That is actually, if it would suffice for us to learn a language in our early years, like many parents are focusing mostly on the first years to pass on their languages and to foster multiple languages in young children or younger children. But would it suffice for us to learn another language in our early years to help us, for example, delay the onset of dementia, or be helpful with whatever brain damage we may encounter later?
Well, I would say I am I think in this case, I believe very much in practice. I think, as I say, for the reasons which I was trying to explain with this switch from the static to dynamic view, practice really matters. I mean, again, I told you, I always like either metaphors from diet or the metaphors from physical exercise. So if we, let's say swimming is healthy, it doesn't mean whether, if I have beautiful crawl and perfect movements and never go swimming, it will not really help my health. But if I go swimming regularly, I might not have my perfect movements, but it will still have an effect. So from this point of view, I see things much more through the prism of practice than of some kind of abstract knowledge. And then really it matters how much we do it. And that is connected with this idea of cognitive reserve, that basically practicing different languages is this permanent cognitive exercise.
Well,
Going back to when you said that like 4 or 5 hours a week would be good, and like 2 hours a week is not really enough. So when we transfer this to a school setting, and especially here in the UK, there's less and less foreign languages at school. There is not enough emphasis. So what would you say? Would it then be perhaps better to efficiently have many hours on a shorter period, or because as a matter of fact, we know that 1 hour a week, children do not become confident speakers.
I would say anything is better than nothing, but as I say, we have to be realistic in our expectations. So there is, for instance, very nice work. I don't know if someone that you kind of invited or will invite in future, Florence Miles from Colchester, University of Essex, who was kind of making a very nice point that children will not learn a language just because they have, an hour or two early on. But those children who were exposed to a second language early will have much more positive attitude and are much more likely to learn another language later on. So from this point of view, you are, you might not reach big, effect, but you are putting a kind of a seed of curiosity and positive attitude, which then later on might very much lead to it. So I think we have to look also at a kind of long-term attitudinal content. And I'm glad about this question, because one of the things which I kind of miss a little bit in a lot of current research is that the field of cognitive science and the field, let's say, of sociolinguistics, social, are very, very disparate. I mean, there's hardly any communication between them. But in fact, we should see it together. So let's say, I could say maybe, this kind of little bit at school in the beginning is not enough to establish cognitive effects. But if it's enough to establish an attitude that will make the person then 10 years later go to university and learn a language, then the investment was worth do it. So I think we have to bring together the psycholinguistic and medical and neuroscientific and the sociolinguistic aspects.
Yeah, so to build on that, what I've always thought that if you start with a language, it is very important to make it fun and interesting to start with, and even try to gain some kind of aha experiences, or that I can do this. And that would, even with a little bit of that, we would reach the effect that you just mentioned.
Absolutely. So from this point of view, I would say, it's not, I wouldn't say, oh, well, 2 hours is, means that it's lost time. But as I say, we should also have realistic expectations. So 2 hours a week will not make a child, or an adult for that matter, a fluent speaker of, another language.
Well, if I may play a little bit of a devil's advocate here, because when parents talk to me about when should I start, I always advocate as early as possible. And obviously I am fully aligned with you guys talking about attitude, this building in languages before pride and other psychological barriers are built. But I also saw I learned recently that the brain development is very, very active during the first few years of life. And your brain is built up to about 90% of the adult brain by age 6 or so. So I always like to talk about, okay, I don't know of any data per se pertaining to languages, but if all sorts of development occurs at this stage, I think if you're building a house, the best time to put in all the pipings of the house to make it a good finish is at the beginning, rather than reform, reconstruction later, which can be done, but it's more costly. So if you want to do 2 languages or 3 languages, the best time to do it is probably at the very early stages. So so I'd like to know if, from a medical perspective, at least a physiological perspective, is this true, or is there a very good, real developmental advantage to do it early, to learn these languages,
I think we have it's an excellent question, but I think it depends completely of what you want to achieve. And now again, let me give an example or a metaphor from physical exercise. If you want your child to win Wimbledon, I think it's a good idea to make her or him play tennis very early. Or if you want your child to become, you know, a concert musician, you know, playing saxophone in Carnegie Hall, then probably an early start is good. But if, for instance, you want to stay healthy across your lifespan, then I ask the question back to you. Imagine two people, one of them who was an incredibly good sportsman, maybe even won Wimbledon age, you know, 29, and then from 30 didn't have any movement whatsoever, spent the second half of their life on the sofa watching TV and drinking beer. And imagine a second person who was incredibly unsporty for the first 30 years, and then with 30 took up tennis, never won anything, but was playing twice a week. Which of those people do you think will be healthy at age 60?
Absolutely agree. It's the second person. That for sure.
So
For
the
sure,
point
I
is,
agree.
so if you want to speak a language like a native, a problematic term anyway, that would be a topic for another discussion. I think native speaker is a very, you know, a very, very problematic issue, but many people have this ideal. If you want to pass, so to say, as, you know, someone who grew up there and so on, then of course, the earlier you do it, the better, no question. But if you see languages really as an exercise of the mind, then I would say every age has its advantages. And in some way, I would even say the later, the more important, because your old age will be determined very much by your activities during, you know, second half of your life. So it depends what the goal is. What,
Okay.
so to say, what is the best solution? And that's why I say, you know, the best thing
I
is
agree.
always have one language early, one late.
No, I agree. Thank you for your answer. You know, I always say
on the safe side.
if you start early, you still have a chance to do it late. But if you start late, you'll never have the chance to start early.
Absolutely.
So, but before we continue, this is, you know, absolutely a fantastic discussion, and all our audience is nodding, I think, in agreement right now. And I'd like to first, you know, acknowledge everybody who's watching right now. We've got lots of questions that are coming up your way, Thomas. So hang on tight. But definitely just a hello to everybody. You know, we have Josie, we have Plinio, we have Maria, we have Anna, we have Karina, and Michelle, and I must be missing, you know, people who have not commented. I don't know, but we've got, you know, loads of people who are watching right now. So you're a very popular guy, Thomas.
Thanks. That's lovely to hear.
So we have a few questions, but do we want to maybe take one from the crowd right now? We have time reserved for the crowd later. So, you know, definitely, you guys, we will get to your questions, no doubt. What do you guys think, Uta and Rita? Should we take one from the crowd?
Yes, I think we can add ours at the end if there is.
Okay. Yes, definitely. We want the people to participate.
Yes. So
we've got yeah.
Uta, are you gonna?
I'll go. So Plinio Tony, welcome Plinio Tony. So he's asking, could I say that non-native, okay, let's not go into the discussion about the native, but non-native bilingual parenting might have the same effect than native bilingual parenting when it comes to cognitive reserve, based on the idea of practicing the language over mastering of the language.
Yeah, that's a very, very good, but I would say quite a difficult question. I mean, firstly, that is something that happens, you know, all the time, that children, I mean, let's say, in a lot of countries and a lot of places, a lot of families, children grow up with parents speaking not their native tongue with them. For instance, maybe because they live abroad, or maybe that's not the language they speak with their partner because the partner doesn't speak the language, and so on and so on. However, usually they will have also access to other speakers of that language. And generally, in order to learn the language, it's good to have as many different speakers as possible, not just one person. So from this point of view, if the parents speak something which is not their native language, but the children also have access to other speakers of that language, this is not a big problem. If they are the only source, then it becomes more difficult. But that's true, by the way, also for language learning at any age and so on. It's good. Language is something which has a lot of variation within the same language. We know we'll have, I mean, women might have a different register than men, already even acoustically and so on. We know that people from different, social groups and so on might use different vocabulary, different grammar. So we learn very, very fast, and there is a variation, a normal, healthy variation, diversity within a language. And that's why I think, in a way, it would work much better if the child has that access to more speakers and not just their parents doing this. I mean, I realize that in many places in the world now, a lot of parents try to speak English with their kids because they think that will be kind of terribly, that will bring them terribly forward. Sometimes it can have exactly the opposite effect. So a colleague of mine in Singapore, Susie Stiles, had a very interesting, study looking at the children where the parents were speaking, were Chinese speakers, but were speaking English at home. They have no advantage speaking English because they learned at school anyway, but they have a disadvantage learning Chinese. So from this point of view, it's something where I would say I would look at the whole picture. I would look at the surrounding. I would look also at the, whether there's really an emotional connection with the language, or whether this is just an exercise because, I want my child to learn and so on. So there is no really one single, so to say, correct answer to this. I mean, it really depends a little bit on the circumstances.
Yes. If I may, there is a question that links to what you just said, Thomas, from Anna. It's a long question. Let me please read it to you. Dear all, my son is nearly 1.5 years old. We live in Serbia. I speak with him in German. I'm a German language professor doing a PhD in a field of bilingual curriculums, and I'm always aware of the advantages of raising a multilingual child. And my supportive husband speaks with him in Serbian. He doesn't speak German. Yesterday, our pediatrician seriously disturbed me by telling me I should stop speaking to my son in German because it poses a danger of him developing selective mutism. He hasn't started speaking yet. I notice he understands both languages, but I'm suddenly afraid that speaking German to him was a mistake. And at the same, afraid of confusing him by switching to Serbian at this point. What would be the best thing to do now? What I've been doing is still met with extreme prejudice from all sides of multilingualism in children is extremely uncommon here, adding more weight to the situation and making it all the more difficult to decide on the next step. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think a very, a lot of reflection going into it. So you see that this is someone who really, reflects on things and so on. So one point is, I mean, absolutely, it seems that in the surrounding of this person, there's a lot of prejudice and a lot of, lack of knowledge about bilingualism. The idea that children get confused is basically a monolingual myth. I mean, monolinguals always think that, there's only one language, and if you get more than one, you get confused. But it's a little bit like to say, if you see everything only in black and white, then you find color confusing. So there is no, children can distinguish languages practically. I mean, there are some studies showing even in the utero, definitely the moment they are born. The idea that children will not know that this is a different language is absolutely naive. So from this point of view, there is I think there's a lot of prejudice, and I can understand that it's difficult to kind of get it through. In terms of, so to say, keeping German, it would be then good to have more sources than so I would definitely continue with German, but I would look maybe, for instance, there are a lot of, on tablets and so on, there are a lot of German games, German children's songs, and so on, so that the child gets input and realizes it's not just this kind of funny language that only one person in the world, namely my mother, speaks, but that there is a lot of other things and other children playing and so on and so on. I think, I realize that it's not easy, but I think it would be probably best to continue, particularly if the husband is supportive. I mean, the most important thing is really the immediate family. Unfortunately, the wider society in many places is still very, very hostile to bilingualism.
Yes. I think this relates pretty much on what you also mentioned in one of the conferences that you held, I think, at the beginning of the year, where you said also multilingualism is the ideology of fear. right?
Yes.
So
Well,
the
idea is always that there is it's something dangerous. It's something that, you know, you will, absolutely. But I think that's, again, it's a question where, you know, the kind of cognitive and social sciences should see it, you know, should come together, because a lot of prejudices against bilingualism are dressed in pseudo-cognitive arguments. Oh, the child gets confused. But in fact, it's about the social otherness.
Yeah.
So you have basically a social fear being presented as a pseudo-cognitive argument by people who usually don't have much experience with cognitive science.
I would like to just address Anna directly a bit more. Please do join online groups, like Ute runs her group, I have my group, and Tetsu has his group. There you will find a lot of other parents who have been in the same situation as you, and it's always good to get their boost from other parents. And because, yeah, I feel for you. I know that this is a difficult situation, but I completely agree, and we all completely agree, that you should continue with your German, and that the pediatrician is actually not qualified to comment on this.
Yes, there is another question from Michelle. Thank you for your interesting discussion. What are your views on the concept of language hybridity and language repertoires, as opposed to the idea of two or more separate languages?
Oh, how many hours do you give me to answer this?
5 minutes?
Yes, so I would say they are kind of, well, you can take a very scientific debate view on that, or you can take a kind of common sense view. So very often, and I was trying to show it also in the beginning, very often there is a kind of pendulum in the history of ideas, that, you know, we go through one idea and then we go to the other extreme and go back to the other. I mean, I was giving an example that, you know, we thought all language is always in the left hemisphere, then there was the idea, oh no, the new one is on the right, and then it went back. And something like this happens with languages as well. So there was a long time where, let's say, mixing languages was considered to be completely, you know, taboo. And the idea was you should only speak one language, and, for instance, you know, one parent, one language, opal policy, and never to mix. And, you know, if you're at school, you can only speak this language, and so on and so on. So there was almost a fear. And I think this fear was probably also by projecting a monolingual frame of mind onto a bilingual or multilingual child, with the idea that, you know, if you hear, you know, two people speaking two different languages, then you get confused. I would say now we probably move to the other extreme, where, let's say, you know, dense code switching, translanguaging, and so on is being almost idolatrized, where, you know, there is the idea, oh, there is no such thing as language. Everybody of us has a, you know, has a mixture of, you know, of things, and then, you know, we should use it. Now, the point is, it won't work very well, because not everybody is having exactly the same combination of languages. And that is something which kids work very, very fast. I mean, my daughter, you know, by 3 and 3.5, she knew exactly who spoke which languages, and in fact, who spoke them well or not well. And she would say, oh, well, so he speaks, you know, the friend of hers, he speaks Spanish, the mom as well, and daddy tries to speak Spanish, because daddy is English and trying, you know, to learn some Spanish and so on. So kids learn very, very fast, so to say, that. And let's say when she went to speak with her grandmother, then, you know, it had to be Spanish, because the grandmother would not speak any other language. So from this point of view, I think, you know, I try to do a kind of middle view. So on one hand, I don't think we should have this, you know, panic fear of mixing languages. And it's very natural in a multilingual surrounding, particularly if you have all people having the same combination of languages, that you mix them, because you just use the term coming and so on and so on. That's absolutely fine. But I would still say, unless every speaker of that language also speaks the other language, it's good to be able to speak that language. So let's say if I live in Miami, I can probably mix Spanish and English all the time, and most people will understand it. But let's say if I go to London, maybe, speaking English might be a better view, and if I go, let's say, to Buenos Aires or to, Santiago de Chile, then maybe speaking Spanish would be a better idea. So from this point of view, I think I see myself a little bit in the middle between this kind of two extremes.
Yes. We have more questions.
Wow. So, we still have two questions that we had, one that we wanted to continue with the interview, but definitely, people, please continue to write your questions into the chat box. We will get to them. Let's continue with, what was our next question?
If we don't get to them during this live session, then what we will do, we will be online and we will be answering questions in comments as well.
Absolutely.
I actually would like to change one of the questions that we had, because Thomas, before you said it is important to keep learning or keep improving our languages across the lifespan. And I was wondering, is there any difference if, for example, I speak all kind of Romance languages, that I do this until the end, let's say when I'm 90 or something. Mm-hmm. Is there any difference on yes, the physiological part? Would it be more beneficial for my brain to learn to challenge a little bit more my brain, so to say, by learning a language that is not imparented with French, Portuguese, Romansh, Romanian, etc., like Korean?
You were going to say
learning
that.
at the moment. I knew.
That's a very interesting question. Oh yeah.
It's a fascinating question. However, obviously not very easy to answer, for at least two reasons. One is that determining, so to say, what we call linguistic distance is not banal. Very often people use linguistic distance on what languages come from, but in a way it doesn't really matter. What matters is the language spoken nowadays. And then you have very different things, let's say for phonology, for vocabulary, or for grammar. So let me give you a very practical example. One of the kind of famous multilingual countries in Europe, Spain. Everybody would tell that Spanish and Catalan are closely related, and Spanish and Basque are completely different. And that is correct in terms of grammar. That is correct in terms of vocabulary to a large extent. But in terms of phonology, Basque is much more similar to Spanish than Catalan is. Catalan has a lot of sounds which Spanish speakers find difficult, whereas the sound landscape of at least the kind of Spanish Basque is very, very similar to Spanish. So from this point of view, the question is it really, so to say, if you mix and learn, is it more about the sound or more about the words? And I found myself personally, interestingly, that when I give talks in different languages, for instance, that my Spanish interferes more with my Italian, with my Portuguese, which is surprising in terms of grammar and vocabulary, but not so surprising in terms of phonology, which is completely different Portuguese. So in a way, the moment you hear a sound, it's clearly different Portuguese, whereas Italian and Spanish have much more of an overlap. So that's one point. So we don't really know what are the kind of main factors we have to pay attention to. Is it the sound, the phonology? Is it the vocabulary, cognates, and so on? Or is it the grammar? But the second point, even more fundamentally, is we don't know whether, so to say, it's better or worse to have different or similar languages. So you can say, okay, if a language is very different, you have a different frame of mind. You might have a different word order. You have to put everything, in the end of the sentence, or you have an agglutinating language where you have, the kind of suffixes instead of prefixes, and so on and so on. So that gives you a kind of different frame of mind. However, the danger of mixing such two languages is not terribly big. So, I mean, if you speak English and Chinese, you will usually not mix them. But on the other hand, if you speak two languages that are very, very closely related, you have to pay much more attention, because it's very easy to put a word of a language into the other one. So let's say when I speak English and I get tired, I would usually put in German words rather than Spanish or Polish, because they are very similar. In a way, they could quite well function in an English sentence. So from this point of view, if you look from the point of view of kind of keeping attention, then having two languages which are close together is a very, very good, so to say, exercise. So again, like before, I would say my answer is Have both. Learn one language which is very similar to yours and one which is completely different, and then you're on the safe side.
Great. Thank you.
Fantastic. One question. I'm a proud grandmother of two small children whom I'm contributing to the Swedish, learning Swedish here in the UK. I get questions from, because now there are more and more multilingual, multicultural families. So grandparents sometimes find themselves in a situation where they do not speak the first language that their grandchild learns. And I often get questions, or worried grandparents say, what should I do? I am too old to learn this language. What would you tell these grandparents, Thomas?
Well, I would say I would give two answers which contradict each other completely.
Choose one.
Yes. So the first part of the answer is, so one is for to the children, the other is to the grandparents. To the grandparents, I would say it's never too late. I mean, one can learn languages also later on. Of course, you will not sound, like a native speaker and so on knowing how problematic this term is. But I know, for instance, a lovely example that I always cite is, and I was really fortunate to meet this person, Mary Hobson, an English writer who started learning Russian with 56 and did her PhD on Griboyedov, Russian poet of 19th century, with 75. And then published her newest translation of Pushkin's Evgeny Onegin, the kind of one of the main works of Russian poetry, with 90. So I would say you need to know a language relatively well to kind of translate, the best poetry into your own one. So from this point of view, it's true, never too late. But the other completely contradictory or contradicting part of the answer is, I would say, why shouldn't the children learn the language of the grandparents? So from this point of view, I would say the grandparents can be an incredible motivation. And here I can think, and I have to say it with a clear amount of sadness, because my daughter's grandmother just passed away a week ago, and which was very, very tragic in Barcelona. But the fact that she, in fact, was clearly a Spanish speaker and didn't speak English meant that my daughter knew she had to speak Spanish. So speaking English was always easy. And when she had Spanish speakers, or Polish speakers for that matter, who spoke English, then she knew, oh, I can speak English, they will understand me. But with the granny, she had to make an effort. And because she loved her granny, she was making an effort because she wanted to communicate with her. So that's why I say, so I was not joking saying that I'm giving completely contradictory advice. So on the one hand, the grandparents can probably learn it, but maybe for the child, it's better if they don't, so that the children have a motivation to learn a language, because in long term, that will be so beneficial for them.
I wouldn't say contradictory. I'd say complementary.
Or complementary, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the point is, in fact, that's a very interesting question also now, with a lot of kind of minorities in UK. Very often parents came here and they, they wanted to adjust everything, and they were not teaching their children the language. Yeah. But then when the children themselves have a language and now think, oh, maybe they should learn, Punjabi or Bengali and so on. If they are still grandparents, that is a brilliant way of, so to say, overcoming this generation gap, and have the grandparents speaking the other language with their grandchildren so that they can learn it.
So that's
and giving also grandparents an additional sense of purpose in linguistic terms.
Absolutely, and you are reiterating what we were also saying in different sessions, the involvement not only of parents but also of extended family and friends and community, that is fundamental also to maintain and foster all the languages, so the languages of the family that are needed and of the community. Thomas, I think we could talk for hours and explore so many different aspects about today's topic. And I see that there are more questions on the Facebook site. Maybe we can then go over and answer them directly. But alas, our time is limited. So
No, I think we should let's you know the folks did write questions for us. Let's try our best and go through a few more. You know, and some are not really questions. Some are just adding comments to what you were saying. And you know, unfortunately, we couldn't sort of go back and forth with the chat, but we definitely want to acknowledge everybody. You know, Karina says, I agree that 2 hours a week isn't enough. This was early, you know, about your exercises earlier, and you know, she agrees as a coordinator in Brazilian community. We have Karina Marsh. Again, 2 hours is not really okay. I think it's the same comment here.
Well, I presume a lot of people will have the same experience. I'm just trying to sort of say to study it systematically, and I mean very often, you know, we know it from experience, but it's nice to have an empirical, so to say, proof of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Karina has a question. Leading a Brazilian community school with only 2-hour classes a week, I have to say to parents that it's crucial that they can carry on. That they carry on exposing their children to the minority language at home. I mean, I think we all agree, definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, but by the way, but in Brazil, I mean, as I say, we were speaking about it before. Brazil has probably one of the best musics in the world. So in a way, I mean, try to get kids to love Brazilian music, because then, you know, automatically they will get language with it.
Well,
so in a way, trying to have as many sources. I mean, songs bring language as well. And if a child knows a lot, by the way, that was the way how I started learning German. I mean, I spoke only Polish, although my mother was German, but she was singing me German songs. So I knew a lot of texts of songs.
Thomas, I'm sure it was beer that got you speaking German, right? Okay. Yeah, so she wanted your tips. So you answered the question right on. What else do we have? Were you checking out the questions, Ute?
Yes, there is also Pavle Nikolic. I wanted to tie on to Anna's question. She mentioned selective mutism as an argument used by the pediatrician to deter her from speaking German. What is the connection of selective mutism of being raised bilingual or multilingual? I fail to see the direct connection. Thanks.
Well, I don't think there's a direct connection. I mean, there is, and even this is a kind of, you know, complicated. On average, there are bilingual children sometimes often start speaking a bit later than monolingual ones, but then they catch up, and it's only a kind of statistical truth. So there are some children, bilingual or trilingual children, who in fact start speaking very much earlier than monolingual ones. So it's not that it's kind of automatic. It's just that if you look, let's say, at, you know, 1,000 here and 1,000 here, you might get a little bit of a couple of months difference. So it's not really a problem. I could only imagine that if the language is connotated with a lot of negative feelings, then you can have something like elective mutism if the child notices that the moment where German is spoken, everybody is having a negative emotional reaction or so. But it would not be about the German or any language. It would be about the negative reaction of the surrounding, and children are of course seeing that. So from this point of view, I don't think there's any connection to mutism. But as I say, if any member of community is becoming ostracized because the way they speak or they look or they do and so on, this might have consequences for the child. So the consequences are not from the language, the consequences are from the ostracism.
Well, so thank you very much for this answer. It's also, I also personally, with my kids, I mean, I have 4 kids. My first one is 8. He, you know, we do 5 languages at home, and he developed very quickly. I mean, relatively quickly, around almost 20 months or so, he was talking. And then my daughter was like about 8 months later than him, almost 3 years old before she started talking. And we were quite worried. And then I was really interested in finding literature on whether more languages does cause delay. And I'm always seeing things that say it's not been proven. Not that it's completely disproven, but there's no strong evidence.
Exactly that. I mean, and if there are any effects, they are slow, they catch up. And as I say, the individual differences, exactly as you say, are much bigger than the difference between monolingual and bilingual.
Yeah.
And also what we need to always keep in mind that the bilingual child's language development shouldn't be compared to a monolingual standard. because it's a different development. So we shouldn't go down that path of comparing apples with oranges.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but I think also talking about selective mutism, it's a situation that can happen also to monolingual children.
Yeah.
And it is, for example, when they go into school and all of a sudden they feel not very much at ease and they stop speaking the language, whereas in other settings they would speak it. So it has to do with other aspects, like Thomas said, but we can maybe expand on this on another time with who asked that, with Pavle.
Pavle does thank you for your answer, though. He said he didn't think about that before, so he's very thankful for that, for your answer.
Yes. So, Thomas, would you have some closing remarks for us for this session today, which was incredibly interesting? And as I said before, we could talk about this for hours.
Oh, but is it okay if we take one last one? I see one last one. We might as well take it. From Sarah, who says, we moved to a new country where we don't speak the language. Our son is 3 and soon starting public school. I'm wondering if watching cartoons in that particular language can help with learning it. Watching TV.
Yeah, well, firstly, I would not be worried about the child not picking up the language. I mean, the only way you can have a child not picking up the language is to have a child locked in a ghetto where basically there's no exposure to it. So the moment where a child plays with other children, goes to nursery school and so on, they pick up the language, whatever the parents speak. You see, Eltern, I said now German word coming into my English. I wouldn't say, rodzice, for instance, the Polish word. So from this point of view, it's very much, I think it's a completely unwarranted fear. I remember one of my, best friends in Germany from Berlin moved with her 2 sons to America. And I remember when she was telling me, oh, well, I'm worried, will they really pick up English? And I say, well, look, I'm sure in 1 year, they will correct your English. And then I remember when I was visiting them in New York and we're going about, across the Brooklyn Bridge. And then she said something like Columbus Day. And then both sons really in unison say, but Mom, it's Columbus Day. So immediately they corrected her pronunciation. So from this point of view, I think, you don't need neither cartoon nor and so on. I would be worried. I would never be worried about the dominant language. The dominant language always wins the day. And as I say, the only exceptions are if you have, of course, a ghetto situation where the child is only living in a kind of, some area where the language is not, the dominant language always wins. I would be worried about the original language that they speak, because the fact that parents speak a language at home doesn't mean that the child will learn it. That is the vulnerability.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you again very much for your time. Uta, you were going to were you going to talk to Thomas for
maybe last thing which I would say is I'm a big fan of Twitter. So here my Twitter handle, H Bak et al.
Oh, we didn't see it completely.
Why I am a fan of Twitter is because I can send links, and you have heard, many of you will have heard Dina Mehmet-Begovic speaking 2 weeks ago about health linguistic diet, the website that we have. And we have also some papers that are written, let's say, from a scientific perspective, but for general public. So with a lot of links to papers, to original materials and so on. And so I usually always kind of tweet them from time to time so that people can have the links. So particularly a paper called Health Linguistic Diet, and another about the multilingualism across the lifespan. And as I say, once you get this paper, they should be written for a general audience, but they have also links to the original paper for those people who really want to kind of go to the sources and check everything for themselves.
For those of you who didn't pick up Thomas's Twitter handle, we will put it in the comments.
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yes, and we will add all the research and the articles that were mentioned in the description of the video on YouTube, and also here in the comments as well. So it is time, yes, that's why I tried again. To ask Thomas.
It's still before 7, so it's we managed to cover quite a big topic, I would say in 1 hour, with a lot of different aspects of it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So we will want to first thank everybody watching on Facebook and giving us great questions. I do see that there are other comments and questions. We will not be able to get to them today, but we will go through them and answer all of your questions over time. So thank you everybody again, and I will put in a link for some feedback. If you can please take a few minutes, give us some feedback on our program, on today's session. If you've seen other sessions, you can also give us some feedback. So that link will be in the comment section, and in the description, I will put it up later, okay? And then I will now hand over to Ute hang on, let me show the screen. I will hand over to Rita to present our next speaker in 2 weeks.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been such an exciting episode and interview. I just loved it. And like you said, like we've said, we could keep on for hours on this. And we will continue on a high, because next time, in 2 weeks' time, we have Dr. Ellen Bialystok from York University in Canada on, and she is a distinguished research professor on the topic of bilingualism and its effects on the cognitive abilities across the lifespan. You may have heard about maybe one of her most interesting researches with regards to bilingualism and what effect it has on the symptoms of dementia later in life. We will, however, focus mainly on the benefits that bilingualism brings to children, but I'm sure we will, like with Thomas, we will cover a lot of other topics as well. So please make sure to mark your calendars and be there in 2 weeks' time.
May I just add that I think probably no one has contributed to this field as much as Ellen did. So I think I would very much recommend this talk.
That is fantastic. Well, thank you very much. In 2 weeks, September 1st, same time, 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. London, and 7 p.m. Paris. Thank you, everybody. We will see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Bye.
Bye.